Before England had kings, before crowns and thrones and dynasties, before the very idea of a single nation had ever taken shape, there was an island that knew only land, blood, memory, and power, an island where authority was earned with strength and loyalty rather than inherited through law. And this island was Britain, a place that existed long before history bothered to name it, shaped by ice, stone, and survival, where human life clung to the edges of rivers and forests and slowly learned to dominate a harsh landscape, because long before Rome dreamed of conquest or chroniclers learned to write, Britain was already old, already layered with stories of migration and conflict, and understanding the birth of England means going back to a time when no one called themselves English at all. The first people arrived in Britain tens of thousands of years ago, crossing land bridges that no longer exist, hunting animals now extinct, adapting again and again as the climate shifted violently between ice and warmth, and when the last ice age retreated and the sea swallowed the land bridge that connected Britain to Europe, the island became isolated, forcing its people to define themselves apart from the continent, developing distinct cultures and identities shaped by geography and necessity. Over centuries these communities grew from scattered bands into organized tribes, bound together by kinship, shared beliefs, and the need for protection, because survival demanded unity, and unity demanded leadership. But leadership in prehistoric Britain was not gentle or ceremonial. It was brutal, practical, and constantly tested. Power belonged to those who could defend land, command warriors, and secure food. And so the earliest British rulers were not kings in the medieval sense but war leaders, chieftains whose authority lasted only as long as their strength and success, and whose downfall could come swiftly through defeat or betrayal. These societies were deeply spiritual, seeing the world as alive with forces beyond human control, believing forests, rivers, and hills held power, and this belief shaped governance itself, because leaders were expected not only to fight but to maintain favor with the gods, to ensure fertility, victory, and balance. And when disaster struck, famine came, or enemies triumphed, leaders paid the price, sometimes with their lives. By the first millennium BC, Britain was firmly in the Iron Age, its people skilled in metalwork, agriculture, and warfare, living in fortified settlements known as hillforts that crowned high ground across the landscape, visible statements of dominance and defense. And these hillforts were not merely refuges but centers of authority, where leaders displayed wealth, controlled trade, and ruled over surrounding lands, creating early political units that resembled kingdoms in everything but name. Trade connected Britain to Europe long before conquest, with tin from Cornwall flowing outward and luxury goods flowing inward, and through this contact ideas traveled too, including new weapons, styles, and social structures. And yet Britain remained fiercely independent, divided into dozens of tribes, each guarding its autonomy, each suspicious of its neighbors, because unity beyond the tribe was rare and fragile. Among these tribes some rose to prominence through strength and strategy, and by the centuries just before the Roman invasion Britain was dominated by powerful confederations like the Catuvellauni in the southeast, the Iceni in the east, the Trinovantes, the Brigantes in the north, and many others, each with its own rulers, laws, and ambitions. And it is here that we begin to see the earliest forms of kingship emerging, not as divine right monarchs but as dominant warlords whose power extended beyond a single settlement or clan. These rulers minted coins bearing their names, a revolutionary act that signaled authority, wealth, and identity, and through these coins we know names like Cunobelinus, a king so powerful that later legend would remember him as Cymbeline, a ruler who controlled much of southern Britain through alliances, intimidation, and trade, demonstrating that Britain was already developing complex political systems long before Rome arrived. Yet these early kings ruled precariously, because power in Britain was personal, not institutional, and loyalty was given to the leader, not the office, meaning that when a strong ruler died, succession was often contested, sparking cycles of civil conflict that weakened tribes from within. Warfare was constant, not always large-scale but ever-present. Raids for cattle, land, or prestige, and warriors defined their status through combat, bravery, and reputation, creating a culture where violence was both practical and symbolic, a means of survival and a language of power. British warriors fought with swords, spears, and shields, sometimes using chariots that astonished later Roman observers, and battle was as much psychological as physical, with displays of courage meant to intimidate enemies and inspire followers, and this emphasis on individual valor contrasted sharply with the disciplined formations Rome would later bring. Society was hierarchical but flexible, with elites displaying wealth through feasting, ornamentation, and patronage, while common people farmed, crafted, and fought when called upon, and slavery existed, though not on the industrial scale Rome would impose, and women held a status that surprised foreign observers, able to inherit property and sometimes rule in their own right, a fact that would have enormous consequences in the century to come. Religion permeated every aspect of life, with Druids acting as priests, judges, and keepers of knowledge, preserving laws and history through oral tradition rather than writing, and this reliance on memory gave British culture resilience but also vulnerability, because what is not written can be erased through violence and suppression, something Rome would later exploit. When Julius Caesar first crossed the Channel in 55 BC, he encountered not a primitive backwater but a vibrant, contested land whose leaders understood diplomacy, warfare, and power, and although his invasions failed to establish lasting control, they changed Britain forever, introducing Rome as a looming presence and exposing the island's divisions. Because some British kings chose to cooperate with Rome, seeing opportunity in alliance, while others hardened their resistance, and this split would haunt Britain for generations. Rome became a distant but powerful force shaping British politics even before conquest, influencing succession disputes, trade, and prestige, and ambitious rulers learned that Roman recognition could strengthen their claim to power, while defiance could isolate them, and thus Rome inserted itself into Britain's internal struggles without ruling it outright. By the early 1st century AD, Britain was therefore not a unified nation waiting to be conquered but a fractured land of competing kings and ambitions, where loyalty was local and fragile, and this fragmentation would prove decisive when Rome returned in force, because no single leader could rally the entire island, and no shared identity yet existed that could unite resistance across tribal lines. What later generations would call England did not exist, and the idea of a single English crown was unimaginable, because Britain was a mosaic of peoples who identified themselves by tribe, land, and lineage rather than nation, and yet within this chaos lay the foundations of kingship itself, because Britain had already learned to follow rulers, to obey authority, to fight for leaders whose power rested on protection and success, and these instincts would later be reshaped rather than erased by conquest. The tragedy of early Britain is that its strength was also its weakness, because fierce independence prevented unity, and local loyalty undermined collective defense, allowing an external power with discipline and organization to exploit internal division, and this lesson would echo throughout English history again and again. When Rome finally prepared its invasion under Claudius, it did not face an unruled wilderness but a land already governed by kings, queens, warriors, and priests, a land with laws, customs, and traditions deeply rooted in place, and the conquest that followed was not the beginning of British history but a violent interruption of it, a collision between an ancient island culture and an empire that believed history began only when it wrote it down. To understand England, to understand why its kings would later rule as they did, suspicious of outsiders, obsessed with land, authority, and legitimacy, one must begin here, in this pre-Roman world where power was personal, contested, and earned through force and loyalty, because Rome did not invent kingship in Britain, it transformed it, and the shadows of these first rulers, unnamed and unrecorded, still linger beneath every crown that would one day sit upon the English throne, waiting for the moment when Britain's fractured past would be forced into unity by conquest, and the long, painful story of England would truly begin.